Today, I'm going to tell you the incredible story of Grace Mitchell, a single mother who opened her home to a quiet stranger on a rainy night. She only wanted to save her family, but the man who crossed her doorstep carried a past darker than she could imagine. And in the chaos that followed, she discovered love where she least expected it, inside the heart of a ruthless mafia boss. Grace Mitchell double-checked the address on the online listing, her finger hovering over the photo of her small craftsman house in the rainy glow of dusk. She took a shaky breath. This had to work. Renting out the spare room was her last resort to keep the roof over her and Lily's heads. Outside, the autumn evening had brought a storm. Rain drummed on the porch roof as Grace peered through the front window at the empty street. A single mom and a stranger under one roof. It sounded like the start of a bad idea, but she was out of choices. The hospital bills, the mortgage, and the leaking kitchen ceiling all piled up in her mind. She pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to quell the nerves. "It's fine," she whispered to herself. "People do this all the time." A bolt of lightning flashed in the distance as the clock on the wall ticked past 7 p.m. Her new tenant was late. She wondered if he'd changed his mind. Part of her would be relieved. Letting a stranger into her home made every protective instinct flare. But without the extra income, she didn't know how long she and her 6-year-old daughter Lily could hold on. The thought of Lily sleeping peacefully upstairs steeled Grace's resolve. She had to be brave for her little girl. The extra money from a renter could mean a stable life, maybe even a new pair of shoes for Lily, or paying off the last hospital bill from when Lily broke her arm last spring. Grace jumped as a sudden gust of wind rattled the screen door. She rubbed her arms, realizing she'd been standing tense in the entryway for too long. The room was dim except for the warm glow of a lamp in the hall and the blue flicker of the TV in the living room playing Lily's favorite cartoon on low volume. She'd let Lily fall asleep on the couch waiting to say hello to the new friend coming to live with them. Grace had tried to explain the situation in gentle terms. "Mommy found someone nice who needs a place to stay, and he'll help us with money so we can keep living here." Lily had accepted that with the carefree trust of a child, more excited about a new face in the house than worried about the implications. Adults weren't so easily trusting. Grace knew too well the dangers of trusting strangers. But the background check she ran had come up clean, and the man, Nick, he called himself in the emails, had been polite in his messages. He was a traveling freelance writer, he'd said, looking for a quiet place to work for a few months. His company would pay generously for somewhere with a homey atmosphere. It sounded odd at first, but his references had checked out, at least on paper. And the rent he offered was above her asking price, almost too good to be true. The doorbell rang, sharp and decisive, cutting through her thoughts. Grace's heart leapt into her throat. "He's here." She hurried to the door and pulled it open, bracing herself with a polite smile. The sight on her porch took her breath for a moment. A tall figure stood in the rain, water dripping from a black baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wore a dark jacket that clung to broad shoulders, and in one gloved hand he carried a duffel bag. "Ms. Mitchell?" His voice was deep, with a rough edge, as if he didn't use it much. Grace nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, I'm Grace. You must be Nick." She had to raise her voice over the downpour behind him. He lifted his head slightly, enough that the porch light caught his face. Grace's first impression was of chiseled angles, a strong jaw peppered with dark stubble, a straight nose, and striking eyes of a gray-green hue that seemed almost otherworldly against the darkness. A faded bruise yellowed on his cheekbone just below a small scar. He looked exactly like the photo ID he had sent, handsome in a distant sort of way, but more imposing in person. A shiver skated down Grace's spine that wasn't entirely from the chill. Nick managed a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach those guarded eyes. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "The weather..." He didn't need to explain. The storm had only worsened. Grace stepped aside quickly. "Please, come in. You're soaked." Nick hesitated a split second before crossing the threshold, as if taking a moment to survey the interior even as rainwater pooled at his feet. Grace closed the door behind him, muffling the sound of rain. Now, in the warm light of the foyer, he removed the baseball cap and slicked back damp, dark brown hair. Without the cap, he looked younger than Grace had expected. Maybe mid-30s, with a few strands of silver at his temples that gave him a distinguished air. Still, there was something ageless in his stance, a wary tension like he was ready for anything. Grace offered a small laugh to break the silence. "I'm sure the pictures in the listing didn't do it justice," she said, motioning around at the cozy foyer and living room visible beyond. It was a modest house, but she kept it tidy and warm. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon from a candle on the side table mixed with the scent of rain as Nick stepped further in. "It's nice," he said quietly. He slipped off his wet shoes without prompting. An unexpected courtesy that surprised Grace. He set them by the door, water still dripping from the hem of his jacket. She noticed he carried himself carefully, like someone who didn't want to disturb a single thing in her home. "And thank you for letting me stay on such short notice." "Of course." Grace found herself studying him as he spoke. Up close, Nick's presence was even more intense. He was easily over 6 feet, with an athletic build under that damp jacket. As he shrugged it off, she saw the fabric of his gray Henley shirt cling to a well-defined torso. There were bruises on his forearms, too, just faint smudges. Perhaps he was clumsy or had been in some accident. She realized she was staring and quickly cleared her throat. "Can I take your coat?" He handed it to her, his hand brushing hers for an instant. It was ice cold from the rain, and Grace bit back a gasp at the shock of it. Nick withdrew quickly, a flicker of something like apology in his eyes. Grace hung the wet jacket on a hook by the door, trying to hide how her own hand trembled just a touch. She wasn't used to having a man in the house, especially not one radiating an aura of contained power like this. Before the silence could become awkward, Grace gestured down the short hallway. "Let me show you your room. It's just this way." She kept her voice soft, mindful of the sleeping child nearby. Leading him past the living room archway, she glanced at the sofa where a little girl with honey-blonde curls lay bundled in a purple fleece blanket, mouth slightly open in sleep. The cartoon had long since ended, and the TV now played a silent infomercial. Grace felt a pang of guilt. She'd hoped Lily could say hello, but it was past her bedtime. Nick's footsteps fell almost soundlessly behind Grace. When they reached the base of the stairs, he noticed the small figure on the couch. He paused, expression shifting. "Your daughter?" he asked in a low murmur. "Yes, that's Lily." Grace smiled softly at her sleeping girl. "I'm sorry, she wanted to wait up to meet you. But I think excitement got the better of her." Grace carefully clicked off the TV, plunging the living room into warm dimness. Lily stirred at the absence of noise, rubbing her eyes. Nick held back as Grace went to Lily's side. The little girl blinked awake, and upon seeing the tall stranger in the hallway, her eyes went wide with curiosity rather than fear. Grace smoothed Lily's curls. "Honey, our guest is here. You can say hello, then it's straight to bed." Lily sat up, clutching her blanket, a shy smile creeping onto her face. "Hi," she said in a small voice. Nick stepped forward under the archway, offering a gentle nod. He didn't quite smile, but he softened his stern face in a way that seemed almost instinctive with a child. "Hello, Lily, I'm Nick." His voice, still deep, had a gentleness to it now. "Sorry to wake you up." Lily shook her head, now fully awake with fascination. "You're going to live here?" Grace answered for him, brushing Lily's hair back. "For a little while, yes. Mr. Nick will be renting the upstairs room." "Remember I told you about that?" "Uh-huh." Lily looked at Nick again. "Are you a writer? Mommy said you write stories." Nick cleared his throat, and for a moment Grace noticed a flash of discomfort in his eyes. Then it was gone. "Something like that," he said softly. "I write about people." Lily's face lit up, her earlier grogginess forgotten. "Can you write about me?" "I'm people," she declared, then flushed and giggled. Grace laughed under her breath, a little embarrassed. "Okay, Miss Chatterbox, that's enough for tonight," Grace gently interjected, lifting Lily's slight weight into her arms. Lily wrapped her arms around Grace's neck, but kept her gaze on Nick. "Good night, Mr. Nick," Lily offered politely. Nick gave a slow nod. "Good night, Lily." His eyes followed them with an unreadable expression as Grace carried her towards the stairs. "It was nice meeting you." "You too," Lily chirped sleepily. Grace felt Nick's gaze linger as she ascended the stairs with her daughter. She glanced over her shoulder and found him standing in the hall, duffel bag in hand, a solitary figure in her home. His guarded stance had relaxed a fraction. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but Grace thought he looked almost wistful watching Lily wave goodbye over Grace's shoulder. After tucking Lily into bed and kissing her forehead goodnight, Grace returned downstairs. She found Nick where she'd left him, standing in the hallway. He had set his duffel bag at his feet and was quietly examining a framed photo on the wall. Grace's chest tightened for a moment. She knew which photo it was without looking. In the picture, a younger Grace smiled brightly at the camera with a baby-faced Lily in her arms, and her late husband, Mark, grinning beside them. It was taken just a year before the accident that took Mark's life. Nick turned at Grace's approach, his face impassive but respectful. If he guessed the story behind the photo, he said nothing. He simply waited, hands by his sides. Grace cleared her throat gently. "That was my husband," she offered softly, not sure why she felt compelled to explain. "He passed away 3 years ago." Something flickered in Nick's eyes. Sympathy, perhaps understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, voice sincere and low. There was a weight to his apology that made Grace feel he truly meant it. "Thank you." Grace managed a small, sad smile, then gestured toward the stairs. "Your room is upstairs. Let me show you." He picked up his duffel and followed her. They moved quietly to avoid waking Lily, ascending the creaky staircase. The house was old enough that every step announced itself. Grace hoped the noise wouldn't bother him during his stay. At the top of the stairs, Grace led him to the open door of the guest room. "Here we are," she flicked on a lamp. The room was modest but comfortable. A full-sized bed with a blue quilt, a dresser, and a small desk under the window. She had placed a vase of fresh daisies on the desk to add a welcoming touch. Nick surveyed the space. He didn't smile, but he gave a small nod. "This is perfect. Thank you." "Bathroom is right down the hall on the left," Grace said, keeping her voice soft. "We share it, but I'm used to coordinating from back when—" She trailed off, not finishing the mention of her husband again. "Anyway, feel free to use the kitchen any time. There's fresh coffee in the morning. I usually get Lily ready for school by 7. I hope that won't disturb you if you like to sleep in." Nick set his bag at the foot of the bed. "That's fine. I'm an early riser." He glanced at her, as if hesitating on something. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a thick envelope. "Here's the first month's rent, cash, as we discussed, and a bit extra up front. I prefer paying ahead." He extended it to her. Grace's eyes widened at the envelope's heft. She accepted it, feeling the surprising thickness of the bills inside. She hadn't expected so much at once. "Oh, thank you. This is—" She peeked and saw several $100 bills, more than enough for the month plus deposit. It was both a relief and faintly alarming to have that much cash in hand. "I appreciate it. You really didn't have to pay all at once." "I don't want to inconvenience you," he said simply. "Consider it a sign that I'm committed to staying for the agreed term." His tone remained polite, but distant enough to discourage further fuss. Grace nodded, tucking the envelope into her cardigan pocket for now. "Of course. Thank you." She cleared her throat. "Well, I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, extra towels, a midnight snack, feel free to knock on my door. It's just down the hall on the right." Nick met her gaze. For an instant, Grace felt those green-gray eyes search her face, as if he wanted to say something more. But he only replied, "Will do." "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Nick." She offered a final polite smile and gently pulled the door closed as she left. As Grace retreated to her own bedroom, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This is really happening, she thought. There was a stranger living in her house now. A stranger with kind manners but haunting eyes. A man who traveled light and carried bruises on his skin. A man who paid in thick envelopes of cash. She paused in the hallway, listening. From the other side of Nick's door, there was only silence. The storm had eased outside to a steady patter of rain. In the quiet, Grace couldn't help wondering just who exactly she had invited into their lives, and what secrets he might be keeping. By the time dawn's early light filtered through the lace curtains of the kitchen, Grace found she wasn't the first one awake. She padded down the stairs, adjusting the belt of her robe, and paused at the sound of quiet movement. In the kitchen, Nick stood by the counter, pouring steaming water from the kettle into a mug. He was already dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, feet bare on the linoleum floor. The early sun highlighted the defined muscles in his arms and the subtle bruise on his left forearm. He looked up as Grace entered, his guarded expression softening marginally. "Good morning," he said. "Hope I didn't wake you." The kettle was a bit loud. "Not at all." Grace smiled, a little surprised. She hadn't expected her tenant to be awake at 6:30. "You're up early." Nick shrugged lightly. "Force of habit. I don't sleep much." He held up the kettle. "I was just making coffee. Can I pour you a cup?" Grace blinked again in surprise. "Sure, that'd be great. Thank you." She moved to the cupboard to fetch her favorite mug, but saw it already on the counter. He must have noticed which one she used from yesterday. A small gesture, but unexpectedly thoughtful. As he poured coffee through the filter, Grace noticed how he kept things neat. He had laid a dish towel on the counter to catch any drips, and washed the French press he must have used. In the early morning calm, he seemed more at ease, though his eyes were a million miles away. "How do you take it?" he asked over his shoulder. "Oh, just a splash of cream." He added cream from the fridge to her mug and handed it to her. Their fingers didn't quite touch this time. Grace felt a curious little flutter in her stomach nonetheless as she took the warm cup. "Thank you," she said, then added, "You really didn't have to. But this is nice." Nick gave a half smile. "Least I can do. I appreciate you letting me stay here." He cradled his own mug, the rising steam fogging the air between them. There was a quiet moment as they stood across the counter from each other, the only sounds the ticking clock and the faint whoosh of the heater kicking on. Searching for something to say, Grace asked, "Did you sleep all right? I know the storm last night was pretty loud." "I've slept through worse." The corner of his mouth twitched wryly, hinting at a private joke or memory. "The room is comfortable. Thank you." "Good." She found herself wanting to ask about the worse he mentioned. What kind of experiences had he been through? But before she could frame a polite inquiry, a patter of smaller feet came thumping down the stairs. Lily burst into the kitchen, still in her unicorn print pajamas, hair a messy halo around her face. "Mommy, I smell coffee," she announced. Then she spotted Nick and beamed. "Hi, Mr. Nick." Her shyness of last night had vanished. Nick turned fully toward the child, and Grace watched a subtle transformation in him. The hard edges of his posture gentled. "Good morning, Lily. You're up early. I get my cereal before school." Lily padded right up to him, utterly fearless. Her eyes went to the kettle and mugs. "Do you drink coffee? Mommy says I can't have coffee till I'm a grown-up." Nick crouched slightly to be more at eye level with Lily. The sight was oddly heartwarming, this formidable man making himself smaller to engage a child. "That's true. Coffee is for grown-ups. But maybe I can get you some juice." Lily nodded eagerly and scampered to the fridge to retrieve the carton of orange juice. Grace stepped forward ready to help, but Nick was already beside Lily, easily reaching a cup from the higher shelf she couldn't. He poured the juice with surprising deftness and handed it to the little girl. "Here you go. Thanks." Lily took a big gulp, ending up with a mustache of orange foam. Nick actually chuckled under his breath, and Grace's eyes widened slightly at the warm sound. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, or even truly smile. It changed his face, lightening something haunted in his eyes. Lily giggled, wiping her mouth on her sleeve before Grace intervened with a napkin. "Are you going to write about me today?" she asked Nick between sips. "You said you write about people." Nick blinked, clearly having forgotten his white lie from the night before. I might," he recovered smoothly. "Maybe you can tell me some ideas after school." "Okay, I have lots of ideas." Lily beamed and scurried to the table with her juice, now focused on the cereal box waiting there. Grace mouthed a silent "thank you" to Nick for humoring the child. He just gave a slow nod, taking a sip of his coffee. But his eyes lingered on Lily, who was happily munching cereal and swinging her feet. There was that same wistful look Grace had caught last night, as if seeing a scene through a window that he couldn't quite join. Grace felt a pang of curiosity and empathy. There was more to Nick than met the eye. That gentle attention to her daughter. Was it just a polite act, or did it hint at some hidden ache in him? Before she could wonder further, Grace glanced at the clock. Time to get the day truly started. She downed the rest of her coffee. "Lily, finish up so we can get you dressed for school," she instructed. As Lily trotted out of the kitchen to her room, Grace gathered her courage to ask a little more of the man who was now sipping coffee at her kitchen counter. "So, Nick, do you have any plans today?" she ventured casually. "I mean, if you're freelance, I suppose you make your own schedule." He looked up from his mug, gaze steady. "I do. I have some research to do online, and I might explore the town later, get a sense of the place." "That sounds nice. We have a few good cafes and a library downtown if you like working out of the house sometimes." She wiped a stray drop of juice from the counter to busy her hands. "Where are you from?" I noticed a bit of an East Coast accent, maybe. Nick's expression didn't change, but Grace sensed a subtle withdrawal, like a clam closing its shell. "I've moved around a lot," he said carefully. Originally New York, but I haven't been back there in a long time. Oh, a New Yorker. That's far from here. Grace laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension she felt creeping in. Well, I hope our little town isn't too boring for you. Boring sounds perfect. He offered that half smile again, which effectively ended that line of conversation. Grace nodded, respecting his privacy for now. Everyone had things they didn't want to talk about. She certainly understood that. If you need anything, feel free to help yourself. I usually drop Lily at school and then head to my job for a few hours. I work over at Millie's on 3rd Street, the bakery cafe. Their muffins are to die for. She realized she was babbling and shut her mouth, flushing slightly. To her relief, Nick didn't seem bothered. Fresh muffins, got it. I'll have to stop by sometime. He rinsed his empty coffee mug in the sink without being asked. Another courteous gesture that Grace noted with appreciation. Lily reappeared in record time, dressed in pink leggings and a denim jumper, her hair clumsily pulled into pigtails. Grace bit back a smile. Clearly Lily had tried to get ready herself. Look, Mommy, I'm ready. Almost, sweetie. Grace quickly fixed one sagging pigtail and grabbed Lily's backpack. All right, we need to head out. Nick, you're welcome to anything in the fridge. I'll be back by early afternoon. Thank you. I'll probably be out for a bit too, he replied. Grace ushered Lily toward the front door, tugging on her own coat. Lily waved enthusiastically at Nick. Bye! Have fun writing, she chirped. Nick raised a hand in a gentle wave. See you later, Lily. Good day at school. As Grace opened the door, she caught one last look at Nick standing in her kitchen, the morning sun catching in his hair and those thoughtful eyes. See you later, Nick, she said, and was surprised by the genuine warmth she felt in those words. Later, he replied softly. As Grace closed the door behind them, stepping out into the crisp morning with Lily skipping ahead, she realized she was smiling. Despite all her anxieties, something about having Nick there felt oddly reassuring, as if an extra pillar of support had quietly appeared in their lives. Yet she also couldn't shake the questions. Who was he really, this polite, distant man with scars on his knuckles and sadness in his eyes? It turned out the little town wasn't always so boring after all. That night, long after Lily had been tucked in and the house had gone dark, Grace awoke with a start. At first, she wasn't sure what had pulled her from sleep. The digital clock by her bed glowed 2:13 a.m. in pale blue. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie quiet. Grace held her breath. Then she heard it, a faint metallic clatter from outside near the back of the house. Her heart kicked into a faster rhythm. Probably a raccoon knocking over the garbage bin again, she told herself. Still, she slid out of bed and crept to the window. Peeking through the curtain, she could just make out the backyard lit weakly by a neighbor's security light. The silhouette of the old tool shed loomed. She squinted, and her pulse jumped as she saw a flicker of movement by the shed door. Grace's first thought was Lily. Was the door to her room shut? Was she safe? She hurried across the hall to Lily's bedroom and found her daughter fast asleep, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Exhaling slowly, Grace gently closed Lily's door. She debated whether to call the police or maybe wake Nick. But what if it really was just an animal? She didn't want to bother him over nothing. Another soft thump from outside made up her mind. Heart in her throat, Grace tiptoed downstairs. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the only thing resembling a weapon that she owned, and quietly unlocked. The back door off the kitchen, a crisp chill hit her as she slipped out onto the back stoop. The grass was wet and shining with recent rain. In the faint light, she could see the padlock on the shed door jiggling. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was trying to break the lock. Grace's stomach lurched. Why would anyone want to get into her shed? The only things in there were an old lawnmower and boxes of Mark's leftover tools and junk. Summoning courage, Grace called out, "Who's there?" "I'm calling the police." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. For a second, the jiggling stopped. Grace tightened her grip on the flashlight. Then, with a burst of scraping metal, the padlock snapped, clearly cut by something, and the shed door inched open. A figure slipped out from behind the door. In the dim light, Grace saw a man in a hoodie, face obscured by darkness. He held something, a crowbar, gleaming in one hand. "Don't come any closer," Grace warned, raising the flashlight high like a baton. Her insides felt like jelly, but she tried to stand her ground. "I'll scream. My neighbors will hear." The man let out a low chuckle. "No one's gonna hear, lady. Put that down and mind your own business, and you won't get hurt." He stepped forward, unconcerned by her threat, the crowbar resting over his shoulder in a chillingly casual way. Grace's mouth went dry. She realized how isolated their little house was at the end of the lane. The nearest neighbor's light was a distant speck. Maybe they wouldn't hear her after all. "Please, just take whatever you want and go," Grace said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. She wondered if he was after Mark's tools to sell, or worse, if he had seen her and Lily in town and had other intentions. The thought made her knees weak. The intruder kept advancing. "What I want isn't in the house. Just some valuables I heard might be in this shed." Valuables? There was nothing of great worth there as far as she knew. Grace's mind raced, confusion laced with fear. "I'm telling you, there's nothing valuable." She was cut off by a sudden blur of motion from her right. Out of nowhere, a dark figure lunged past Grace, placing itself between her and the hooded man. It was Nick. Grace's breath caught. She hadn't heard him behind her at all. He must have been awakened by the voices. Now he stood a few paces ahead of her on the lawn, shirtless and barefoot in just sweatpants, as if he'd jumped straight out of bed. His stance was lethal calm, body balanced on the balls of his feet. "She told you to leave," Nick said quietly. In the silence of the night, his low voice carried an unmistakable warning. The intruder halted, startled by Nick's sudden appearance. "Back off, buddy, this doesn't concern you," he spat, recovering with bravado. He swung the crowbar down threateningly. Grace's heart was in her throat. The contrast between the two men under the weak light was stark. The intruder was scrappy, medium build, his movements jittery. Nick, on the other hand, was tall, solid muscle, and preternaturally still, like a predator locking onto prey. "I won't ask again," Nick said, steel in his tone. "Drop it and leave." Something in Nick's voice or posture must have registered as dangerous, because the intruder faltered. But whatever sense of self-preservation he had was quickly snuffed by anger or desperation. "Screw you!" the man growled and rushed forward, raising the crowbar with a wild yell. Grace screamed, "No!" She watched in terror as the man brought the metal bar swinging toward Nick's head. It all happened in 2 blinks of an eye. Nick sidestepped with inhuman reflexes. His arm shot out and caught the man's wrist in a vice grip before the crowbar could connect. The intruder let out a pained shout as Nick twisted his arm. The crowbar clattered to the ground. In the faint light, Grace saw a flash of Nick's expression, utterly cold, focused, and for the first time, truly frightening. With one hand, Nick yanked the intruder forward off balance. Then he drove a fist hard into the man's stomach. The intruder doubled over with a whoosh of air, collapsing to his knees. Nick released his wrist only to grab the front of the man's hoodie. With shocking ease, he lifted the smaller man and slammed him against the shed wall. The thud was sickening. Grace stood frozen, the flashlight beam dancing crazily across the ground as her hand shook. She had never seen anyone move like that, so fast, so efficient at incapacitating someone. Her mind caught up with reality in fragments. Nick had disarmed and disabled an armed intruder in seconds, and now held him pinned. Nick leaned in, face inches from the intruders, and spoke in a low voice that sent a chill down Grace's spine. "If you ever come near this house again, you won't walk away next time." The hooded man whimpered, his bravado gone. "Oh, okay, let me go," he groaned. Nick's fist twisted in the man's hoodie. For a terrifying moment, Grace feared he might do something extreme. She found her voice, forcing it past the lump in her throat. "Nick," she said softly, pleadingly. At her voice, Nick seemed to come back from a dark place. He looked over his shoulder at Grace. Even in the dimness, she saw the feral light fading from his eyes, replaced by concern. He looked back at the intruder and snarled quietly, "Get out of here." Then he released the man, who crumpled to the wet grass, gasping. Nick stepped back as the intruder scrambled to his feet and stumbled away into the night without a backward glance, clutching his stomach. Grace sagged against the porch railing, adrenaline making her knees weak. It was over. The danger had passed as quickly as it erupted. Nick turned to Grace. In the faint glow, she could see he was breathing hard, chest heaving. Rain droplets from the earlier storm clung to his bare skin, and a smear of blood, maybe not his own, glistened on his knuckles. His eyes searched her face. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine," Grace managed to whisper. Her pulse was still racing. "Lily," she gasped, suddenly remembering the child. "I should check on her." Nick nodded, running a hand through his hair as if steadying himself. "Go, I'll take care of things here." He stooped to pick up the dropped crowbar and the broken padlock pieces. Grace hurried inside, legs trembling. She rushed upstairs to find Lily still fast asleep, thankfully oblivious to the nightmare that had played out in the backyard. Gently, Grace closed her daughter's door again. Her heart ached at the sight of Lily's peaceful face. She doesn't know how close. Taking a deep breath to compose herself, Grace returned downstairs. She found Nick in the kitchen now, the back door locked. He had rinsed his hands and was wiping them with a paper towel. The crowbar leaned against the counter. In the brighter kitchen light, Grace could see that the blood on his knuckles was indeed not his. He seemed uninjured. Meanwhile, a bruise was already blooming on the side of the intruder's arm, where Nick must have gripped him. "Did you call the police?" Nick asked quietly. His tone was neutral, but there was a tension underlying it. "No, not yet," Grace said. In truth, the thought had fled her mind during the chaos. Should she call now? Her eyes flicked to the window. The intruder was long gone. I guess I should report a break-in attempt, but he didn't get anything. And I didn't exactly get a good look at him, just a hoodie. Nick was quiet, tossing the red-stained paper towel in the trash. Grace realized she was staring at him, at the transformation she'd witnessed. He'd been utterly ruthless subduing that man, a skilled fighter, to put it mildly, not something she expected from a writer. "You could have been hurt," Nick said, breaking the silence. His voice was still low, but there was a rawness to it now as he looked at her. "You shouldn't have gone out there alone." The rebuke in his words made Grace bristle, an unexpected embarrassment flaring now that the immediate fear had passed. "I didn't know it was a person at first," she replied, defensive. "I thought it might be an animal, and I didn't want to bother you in the middle of the night." Nick closed his eyes for a moment, as if biting back something sharp. "Next time, wake me," he said tightly. "I don't care if it's nothing. Promise me." Grace swallowed, unsettled by the intensity of his concern. "All right, I promise." Her gaze dropped to his battered knuckles. She reached out on impulse. "You're hurt." He drew his hand back before she could touch it, the movement abrupt but not unkind. "I'm fine," he murmured. They stood there in the quiet kitchen facing each other. Grace felt the enormity of what just happened start to settle on her. A stranger had broken onto her property. Nick had likely saved her from being attacked, or worse. And he had done so with an almost frightening efficiency. Her mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Gratitude and relief, of course, but also confusion and a trace of fear. "Who are you?" she thought, as she looked at the man standing barefoot in her kitchen. Looking anywhere but at her now, he had a guarded stance again, as if bracing for judgment. "Thank you," Grace said softly, meaning it more deeply than she could express. "You saved me." Nick finally met her eyes. There was a tautness in his face. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't. She let out a shaky breath. "That man, if you hadn't been here, I don't know what—" She stopped herself, not wanting to imagine the possibilities. Her eyes burned with grateful tears that she stubbornly blinked back. Nick's gaze flickered, and he took a small step closer. "Hey," his voice was gentle now. "You're all right, and Lily's all right. That's what matters." Grace nodded rapidly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, it's the adrenaline, I guess." She gave a tearful little laugh, trying to regain composure. "I'm usually stronger than this." To her surprise, Nick's face softened with something like regret. "You were strong," he murmured. "You stood your ground out there, even knowing no one might hear you. That took guts." His praise, quiet and earnest, warmed her cheeks despite everything. "I was mostly terrified," she admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Nick said. "It means doing what you have to, even when you are scared." There was a rough honesty in his tone, as if he spoke from personal knowledge. Silence fell between them again, but now it felt different, charged, intimate in the low light of the kitchen. Grace realized how close they were standing, just a foot apart. She could see a thin white scar on his collarbone and a faint bruise near his ribs, remnants of old violence. "Who are you?" The question rose again to her lips, and before she could stop herself, she gave it voice. "Nick, how did you learn to fight like that?" He tensed, the openness in his face shuddering once more. Grace regretted the question immediately. "Sorry, that's none of my business," she said quickly, looking away. You moved so fast. It surprised me." Nick exhaled slowly. "I took some self-defense classes, a long time ago," he said at last, each word carefully measured. "And I've been in a few bad neighborhoods. You pick things up. I see. Grace didn't believe that was the whole truth, but she let it drop. She wasn't in a state to pry further. Anyway, I'm really grateful. He nodded, then gently steered her towards the hallway. You should try to get some rest. What about you? She asked softly. After all that, can you sleep? Nick's lips quirked in that almost smile. Don't worry about me. I'll sleep eventually. He paused. I'll stay up a while just to keep watch, in case our friend decides to come back. Grace opened her mouth to insist that wasn't necessary, but the look in his eyes told her it was no use. And truth be told, the idea of him keeping vigil made her feel safer than any locked door. She gave a small nod. All right, if you're sure. I am. With that, Grace turned toward the stairs, exhaustion washing over her now that the adrenaline ebb was crashing. Halfway up, she stopped and looked back. Nick was still in the kitchen doorway, a silent sentinel, making sure she got upstairs safely. Good night, Nick, she whispered. The words carried a weight of gratitude she couldn't fully articulate. Good night, Grace, he replied, almost too softly to hear. As she slipped into bed beside her sleeping daughter, Grace's mind churned. Tonight had changed something. The fear still coiled in her belly, but it was mixed now with a strange, growing trust in the mysterious man down the hall. He had protected them with his very hands. Yet the mystery of who he really was only deepened. Grace promised herself she wouldn't jump to any conclusions. But one thought refused to be silenced as she drifted into a fitful sleep. No ordinary writer knew how to fight like that. Sunlight crept over the horizon far too soon. Grace had managed only a few hours of restless sleep after the night's events. By 6 a.m., she gave up on pretending to rest and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily, who was still snoozing soundly. She peered out her bedroom window down into the backyard. The shed stood with its door closed, a shiny new padlock already in place. Grace blinked in surprise. Had Nick already? She threw on jeans and a sweatshirt and hurried downstairs. The back door was locked, but when she stepped outside, the evidence was right there. A brand new heavy-duty lock securing the shed, and the bent remains of the old lock discarded in a neat pile on the porch railing. Grace found Nick around the side of the house, crouched by the outdoor breaker box with a screwdriver in hand. He had put on a hoodie against the morning chill, the hood thrown back as he concentrated on tightening a loose screw. A small toolkit lay open beside him, likely from Mark's collection in the shed. Nick, she called softly so as not to startle him. He looked up, then stood. Morning, Grace. He sounded as alert as if he'd been up for hours, which perhaps he had. Her gaze went from the new padlock to the breaker box. What are you doing? He finished with one more twist of the screwdriver and closed the metal panel. Reinforcing a few things. The intruder last night might have been scouting. Sometimes they cut power to disable alarms. He pointed to the box. I've secured it with a padlock too, just in case. And I replaced the shed lock. Grace absorbed that. He'd woken up and taken it upon himself to fortify her home before dawn. That's very thoughtful. You didn't have to. Nick began gathering the tools back into the kit. It's nothing. After what happened, better to be safe. She stepped closer. In the daylight, the memory of the night felt almost surreal, but the faint bruise on Nick's knuckles and the ache in her own muscles from tension told her it was all too real. I was thinking of calling the police today to report it, she said cautiously. Even if they don't find the guy, having a report on file. Nick's face remained neutral, but he shook his head slightly. Your call. But if you didn't see his face or have a clear description, they won't do much. Probably just file it away. Grace chewed her lip. He wasn't wrong. And something told her Nick preferred not involving the police. True. I just hate the idea of that man out there. Maybe targeting someone else. He won't be back, Nick said with quiet certainty. Not after how things ended for him here. She shivered, recalling Nick's fierce prowess. Right. Changing the subject, she offered, I can make us some breakfast. It's the least I can do to thank you. Nick paused, then nodded. Breakfast sounds good. Inside, Grace busied herself frying eggs and toasting bread. Lily woke not long after, padding into the kitchen yawning. Thankfully, she was blissfully unaware of the danger that had visited in the night. Grace had decided not to tell her, not wanting to frighten her. As far as Lily was concerned, it was a normal morning. At the table, Lily chattered away about her upcoming spelling test as Grace served scrambled eggs. Nick listened with that quiet attentiveness, even managing to coax a few extra details out of the normally shy girl. Which word is the hardest? Oh, elephant? That's a tricky one. He barely touched his own food until Lily had eaten her fill. Grace found herself glancing at him, marveling at the duality. The same man who last night had been a force of nature, dealing swift violence, now patiently discussed cartoon characters and school projects over breakfast. After Lily ran off to get dressed, Grace refilled Nick's coffee. She wanted to address the elephant in the room, his obvious combat skill, but struggled to find the words. Finally, as she sat down across from him, she decided honesty was best. Nick, I have to be honest. I'm a little confused. He looked up from his mug, eyes wary. About how a freelance writer knows how to disarm armed men and move like a soldier or something. She kept her tone gentle, not accusatory, but her heart thumped anxiously. I don't mean to pry, and I am absolutely grateful. It's hard to wrap my head around. Nick was quiet for a long moment. He stared into his coffee as if debating with himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. I told you, I had some training. Self-defense, boxing. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. Learned how to take care of myself. It was essentially the same answer he'd given last night, and Grace sensed he wouldn't budge beyond that explanation. She nodded slowly. All right, I understand everyone has parts of their past they don't want to talk about. I'm not here to judge you. His gaze lifted, meeting hers in surprise. Perhaps he'd expected more interrogation or skepticism. Grace offered a small, sincere smile. Besides, you've given me no reason to distrust you. Quite the opposite. You protected me and my daughter. That earns a lot of trust in my book. Something in his posture eased. He almost smiled back. I'm just glad you two are safe. They shared a moment of quiet understanding. Grace realized that pressing him might only push him away. He clearly had secrets, maybe dark ones, but everyone was entitled to their secrets. She decided she would let him reveal things in his own time. After all, he had risked himself to keep them safe. She owed him some patience. Mommy, I can't find my other sneaker. Lily's voice echoed from the hall, breaking the tension. Grace sighed, standing up. Duty calls. She gave Nick an apologetic look for the personal questions. Thank you again, for everything. He inclined his head. Any time, Grace. The way he said her name made a gentle warmth bloom in her chest. As she went to help Lily, Grace felt both relief and frustration. Relief that Nick remained kind and steady despite her questions. He hadn't shut down on her. And frustration, because now she was more certain than ever that he was hiding a far bigger story than just a rough neighborhood upbringing. She recalled how he'd looked confronting the intruder, utterly fearless. That wasn't just street smarts, it was training, discipline, like a man who'd seen combat or violence as a way of life. But who was she to complain when those very skills had saved her? Perhaps the wise course was simply to be grateful. Still, as she finished preparing Lily for school, Grace promised herself she would keep her eyes open. Nick's arrival had brought safety, but also mystery into her home, and a little voice in the back of her mind warned that mysteries have a way of demanding attention, whether you invite them or not. Over the next week, life settled into a new rhythm. Grace found herself growing used to the quiet presence of Nick in the house. He was a considerate tenant, tidy, helpful, often out for solitary walks but always home by dinner. If anything, he was a bit elusive, sometimes slipping out to take phone calls on a cheap flip phone he'd bought at the electronics store, claiming poor reception inside. Grace didn't pry. She assumed he was dealing with work matters or talking to far-off friends. He never mentioned any family, and she didn't ask. What she did notice was how easily he fit into their little domestic routine. In the evenings, after Lily finished her homework, Nick would sometimes join them in the living room. At first, he stayed on the periphery, content to read a book in the armchair while Grace and Lily watched cartoons or a Disney movie on TV. But Lily's persistent friendliness soon drew him out. One Friday night, she convinced both adults to play a board game she'd gotten for her birthday. Grace watched, amazed, as Nick patiently let Lily explain the rules, even though they were printed on the box, and then proceeded to lose to Lily on purpose with a theatrical sigh that made the little girl erupt in giggles. Grace's heart warmed at the sight of this hard, secretive man pretending to be thwarted by a 6-year-old's Connect 4 strategy. Later that same night, with Lily fast asleep, Grace and Nick remained on the couch, a gentle awkwardness between them as they realized they'd been enjoying each other's company far past the point of necessity. A classic movie was playing on the TV, one Grace loved from her youth. To her surprise, Nick recognized it and made an offhand comment about the cinematography. That sparked a quiet but earnest conversation that lasted through half the film. They spoke in low voices so as not to wake Lily, touching on childhood favorites, then drifting to more personal topics. Grace found herself telling him about how Mark used to love old films too, and how hard it had been after he died, learning to be both mother and breadwinner. It wasn't a story she opened up about easily, but something about Nick's attentive silence encouraged her. Nick in turn offered a few sparse details about his own past. He admitted he'd lost people too. More than I'd like to think about, he said with a distant look. He didn't name them, but the pain in his eyes was raw and real. Grace sensed that was as close as he'd come to baring his soul, and she squeezed his hand before she realized what she was doing. "I'm sorry," she murmured, "for whoever you lost." He had looked at her then, their hands touching, and for a charged moment, Grace felt something unspoken pass between them, a current of empathy, and perhaps a flicker of something more. Nick gently withdrew his hand after a moment, not rejecting her comfort but seeming unsure what to do with it. "Thank you," was all he whispered. They finished the movie side by side on the couch, not quite touching, but the warmth of companionship filling the space between them. When it ended, Nick carried a sleeping Lily to her bed with a tenderness that made Grace's throat tight, then quietly wished Grace good night. She lay awake for a long time after, staring at the ceiling, wondering how this man had come to mean so much, so quickly, to her and to her daughter, and why, despite the growing trust and friendship between them, an undercurrent of mystery still flowed around him. Another week passed in relative peace, until one chilly Wednesday night when Grace noticed Nick pacing the living room after Lily had gone to sleep. A storm was gathering outside, wind rattling the windows. Grace was folding laundry on the couch, casting occasional glances at him. He seemed deep in thought, jaw tight, as if waging an internal debate. Finally, she broke the silence. "Everything okay? You seem restless." Nick paused, as if surprised he hadn't hidden it better. He offered a faint, reassuring smile that didn't fool her. "I'm fine. Just a bit of cabin fever, maybe. I might step out for some fresh air, clear my head." Grace looked at the dark, gusty night beyond the window. "Now? It's almost 11 and looks like it might storm." Concern laced her voice. He grabbed his coat from the hook. "I won't go far, promise." He hesitated, then added, "I have my phone if you need me. I'll be back soon." Something in his tone made Grace uneasy. It sounded faintly like a goodbye, but she didn't want to pry or appear paranoid. "All right. Be careful," she said softly. Nick gave her one last long look, an intensity in his eyes as if he wanted to say more. Then he nodded and slipped out into the night. Grace's unease only grew as minutes ticked by. The storm broke shortly after midnight, rain slashing against the house. She had gone to bed but couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and listening for any sound of Nick's return. A gnawing worry chewed at her. Where would he go so late? Was he really just clearing his head, or was there more? It was nearly 1 a.m. when she finally heard it, a car engine laboring outside, then the crunch of tires on her gravel drive. Grace sat bolt upright. Through the bedroom window, she saw a dark sedan, headlights off, roll to a stop by the house. Fear spiked. Who could that be? She hurried downstairs, heart in her throat, and made sure the chain was on the front door before opening it a few inches. Rain blew in, and through it, she could just make out someone staggering from the driver's side of the sedan. Nick. He was clutching his side, one hand pressed to his torso, the other braced on the car door. Even in the dark, Grace saw something wet and dark covering his forearm and seeping between his fingers. Blood. "Oh my God, Nick!" Grace fumbled the chain off and flung the door open. He half collapsed against the doorframe, panting. "Inside," he ground out. His voice was strained with pain. Grace threw her arm around his waist, helping haul him indoors. The weight of him nearly buckled her knees, but adrenaline fueled her strength. She kicked the door shut against the rain. "What happened?" she gasped, lowering him onto the entryway bench. Her hands came away from his side, warm and slick. He was bleeding badly. Nick shook his head. In the faint light, his face was ashen, hair plastered to his forehead by rain and sweat. "Grace, you need to pack a bag," he rasped between breaths. "Wake Lily, we have to go, now." She stared at him, thunderstruck. "What? You're hurt. You need a hospital." He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "No hospitals," No cops. His eyes were fever-bright and desperate. Just do as I say, please. We don't have time. Grace's heart pounded. This was no simple injury from a fall or mugging. This was something far more sinister. A chill of fear shot through her. Fear not just for him, but for the implications. Who was after him? Why did they have to flee in the dead of night? Nick, I don't understand. A sudden flash of headlights through the front window cut her off. Another car was coming down the lane fast. Nick's head jerked toward the light. A curse escaped under his breath. They followed, he muttered. With visible effort, he pushed himself upright, swaying. Grace, listen. Grab Lily and get to the car. Back door, now. Outside, the second car screeched to a halt. Through the rain-streaked window, Grace saw two silhouettes inside. Panic flared in her chest. Whoever it was, they had chased Nick, and now they were here. Go! Nick snarled, but his voice was cracking, his strength clearly waning. He stumbled toward the hall table, yanking open the drawer where he'd stashed something earlier. A gun. Grace's eyes widened as she saw him slide a pistol out, chamber around with a grim, practiced motion. Lightning flashed, and in that stark white light, Grace saw the man before her not as the quiet tenant she'd come to know, but as someone else entirely, dangerous, wounded, and determined to protect her at any cost. She didn't waste another second. Grace turned and sprinted upstairs, her mind racing in terror. She snatched a sleeping Lily out of bed, wrapping the confused child in her blanket. Mommy? Lily murmured, half awake and alarmed. Shh, it's okay, baby, Grace whispered, voice shaking as she tried to sound calm. We're going on a little adventure, okay? Keep your eyes closed. Lily clung to her neck, sensing the fear. Grace rushed back down as the first pounding hits rattled the front door. Someone was trying to break it in. Nick was by the kitchen now, gesturing furiously to the back door. My car's in the drive. Get her in, lay her down, and stay low. I'll cover you. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were sharp with resolve. Grace's hands shook as she fumbled with the back door lock. She heard wood splintering in the foyer. The front door wouldn't hold much longer. Nick, please, she pleaded, terrified to leave him. He pressed the keys to the sedan into her hand. Go, he barked, forceful and authoritative. I'm right behind you. Protect Lily. Hearing Lily's name snapped Grace into action. Cradling her daughter tightly, she pushed out into the rain and darkness, sprinting across the short path to the car. The cold downpour drenched them in seconds. Grace yanked open the back door and laid Lily across the back seat. Stay down, sweetie, okay? Lie flat and don't move, she urged. Lily, now fully frightened, nodded tearfully and curled up as instructed. A gunshot cracked through the night and Grace's heart stopped. She spun toward the house, rain blinding her. In a flash of lightning, she saw the front door had burst open. Two dark figures were in the foyer. One advancing inside, another lingering at the threshold. Another shot rang out from inside. Nick! Grace's blood ran cold at the thought of him facing armed pursuers alone and injured. Mommy! Lily whimpered from the back seat. Grace forced herself into motion. She scrambled into the driver's seat, hands slipping on the wet door handle. The keys! She jammed them into the ignition and turned them. The engine coughed to life. Over the roar of rain, she heard muffled shouting from the house, and another crack of gunfire. Every instinct screamed to go back for Nick, but he'd told her to protect Lily. Tears mingled with rain on her face as she put the car in reverse, inching it back from the house to give Nick room to get in. Please, let him get in. A figure suddenly emerged from the back door, running towards the car. Grace's heart leapt. Nick. He clutched his side with one hand and the gun in the other, his face a mask of determination and pain. Behind him, another figure barreled out the door, raising a weapon. Nick, watch out! Grace screamed, barely audible in the storm. Nick twisted as a shot rang out. He staggered but didn't fall, returning fire with two quick blasts that sent the pursuing figure diving for cover. In a heartbeat, Nick reached the passenger side of the sedan. Grace leaned over and shoved the door open. He practically fell into the seat. Go! He shouted, voice raw. Grace didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas. The car fishtailed in the mud before the tires bit into the gravel and lurched forward. Gunfire popped behind them, a bullet shattering the back windshield. Lily screamed from the floor of the back seat. Grace bit back a sob, gripping the wheel white-knuckled and ducking her head as they sped away from the house. Headlights flashed in the rear view. The second car was turning to follow. They're coming after us! Grace cried, panic rising as the outline of a black sedan gained on them down the country road. Nick was breathing hard beside her. "Take a left at the next intersection, toward downtown," he managed between pained breaths. Grace's mind raced. Downtown meant more streets, maybe traffic even at this hour, and possibly somewhere public. But also potentially more witnesses, maybe even police if they were lucky. She clung to that hope and the one thing she trusted implicitly right now, Nick's directions. She squealed around the left turn onto Oak Street, the tires slipping on wet asphalt. The pursuing car swerved to follow, its headlights glaring like angry eyes. "Keep going, don't slow down," Nick urged, turning in his seat to look behind them. Lightning flickered, illuminating his profile and the smear of blood down the side of his jacket. Grace's stomach lurched at how much he might be hurt. But he was focused, eyes narrowed at the car chasing them. As they roared onto Main Street, Grace saw the empty town square ahead. Businesses were dark at this hour. Only the street lamps gave any light. The rain fell in torrents, making visibility poor. Suddenly, Nick reached over and yanked the wheel. "Right!" he barked. Grace gasped, and turned just in time to make a sharp right onto a side lane behind a row of shops. She nearly lost control on the slick pavement, but Nick's hand over hers steadied the wheel. The sedan skidded into the narrow alley, momentarily out of sight of their pursuers. Before Grace could breathe, Nick was grabbing the emergency brake. He pulled it up hard, and at the same time, shoved the gear into park. The car jolted to a stop. "What are you—" Grace started, but Nick was already throwing his door open, gun in hand. "Stay here. Keep her down," he ordered fiercely, and then he was gone, disappearing into the rain and darkness of the alley. Grace huddled in the car, rain pounding on the roof like a drum roll. She kept one hand on Lily's back, feeling her daughter's rapid breaths as Lily lay curled on the seat. "It's okay, sweetie, it's okay," she whispered, voice trembling. She peered over the dashboard, trying to see where Nick had gone. The alley was nearly pitch black except when lightning flickered. Her heart thundered in her ears. What was he doing? Why had he left them? She realized he intended to confront their pursuers, and dread twisted inside her. He was already badly hurt. "He should be with us. We should be escaping together," she thought frantically. A flash of motion at the mouth of the alley caught her eye. The pursuing car had overshot the turn, but now reversed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the intersection. They were searching. Any second they might back up enough to see down the alley. Grace saw a dark figure move behind a dumpster near the alley's entrance. Nick, positioning himself. He held his side with one hand, but the other gripped the gun with steady aim. Her throat clenched at the sight. He was going to ambush them. The enemy car's white reverse lights grew brighter as it edged closer. Grace ducked down, pulling Lily closer, and covered the child's ears. Suddenly, a muzzle flash lit up the alley. Nick's gun thundered 3 times in quick succession. The sedan's back windshield exploded. The car lurched, tires screeching. Return gunfire erupted, bright bursts from the passenger side of the car toward Nick's position. Grace bit her fist to keep from screaming. The alley filled with deafening cracks and the acrid smell of gunpowder. There was a shouted curse from one of the pursuers. The sedan tried to swing around, but one of Nick's shots must have hit home. The vehicle swerved violently and crashed into the corner of the brick building next to the alley, metal crunching. Silence for a half second. Then a figure crawled out of the driver's side, illuminated by a flickering street lamp. The driver, weapon in hand. Nick emerged from cover, striding toward the wreck despite his injury. The driver raised his gun, but Nick was faster. A single shot from Nick and the man crumpled onto the wet pavement with a splash. Another thug staggered out from the passenger side, coughing, his arm hanging limp. He saw Nick, and with a desperate yell, charged at him, swinging a knife that glinted in the rain. Grace couldn't stay passive. Seeing Nick reeling and barely able to lift his gun in time, she acted on impulse. She leaned over and slammed her palm onto the car horn. The blaring sound cut through the night. The charging man flinched at the sudden horn, his step faltering for just a split second. Enough. Nick fired once. The man stumbled, the knife clattering from his hand as he collapsed onto the alley floor, motionless. Grace lifted her hand off the horn, breathless. She scanned for any other movement. Nothing but the rain and the 2 slumped shapes by the smoking car. Nick stood over the second man for a moment, chest heaving. Then his knees buckled and he caught himself on the crashed car's trunk. "Nick!" Grace couldn't stay put any longer. She scrambled out into the rain, leaving the engine running and doors open. She dashed to his side. He had slumped against the wreck, one hand pressed harder against his bleeding side. His face was pale under the street lamp's glow. Grace gingerly touched his shoulder. "Nick, are you—" His gun was still in a white-knuckled grip. At her voice, he started to raise it reflexively, eyes wild. "It's me." "It's Grace!" she exclaimed, hands up. Recognition dawned in his eyes and he lowered the weapon. "Grace," he panted like it was a relief just to say her name. He coughed, swaying on his feet. Grace moved under his arm, bearing his weight. "They're down. We have to go before anyone else comes." Adrenaline made her voice steadier than she felt. The smell of gasoline from the wrecked car prickled her nose. A fire could start. Nick nodded weakly. He allowed her to guide him back toward their car. The rain washed the blood from his fingers in pink rivulets that swirled down the pavement. He was bleeding too much. Grace's stomach churned in fear. She got him into the passenger seat. He practically fell in. Lily peeked up from the back, sobbing with relief when she saw her mother return. "Mommy, is it over?" Grace climbed into the driver's seat, meeting her daughter's terrified eyes in the rearview mirror. "It's over, baby. We're okay," she managed, though her voice cracked. "Stay down just a bit longer, all right?" Lily obeyed, curling back into a ball. As Grace threw the car into gear and sped out the far end of the alley, Nick finally let the gun slip from his hand. It fell to the floor mat with a thud. He slumped against the window, breathing shallowly. "You okay?" he murmured. "Am I okay?" Grace nearly laughed and sobbed all at once. She kept her eyes on the road, adrenaline still flooding her veins. "Nick, you're the one who's—" She bit back the rest, not wanting to alarm Lily further. "Hold on, we're going to get you some help." He made a noise that might have been a grim laugh. "No hospitals?" he mumbled, voice barely audible over the rain and engine noise. "No, I know, but I need to stop the bleeding." Grace's mind raced for a safe haven. She didn't dare go back to her house or anywhere public like a hospital. Then she remembered. The old summer cabin Mark's parents owned by the lake, about 30 miles outside town. It had been sitting empty since Mark's father passed. No one would be there this time of year. It was rustic, but it had running water and a first aid kit at least. Swallowing her fear, Grace headed for the highway. With shaking fingers, she dialed 911 on her phone, intending to anonymously report the location of the shootout to get emergency services there. Maybe that could delay anyone following them. But after ringing twice, she hung up, uncertain. If the attackers had any connections, involving the police might backfire, and what would she even say? Instead, she tossed the phone aside and focused on driving. 10 minutes later, on a dark highway cutting through dense forest, the adrenaline that had kept Grace going began to ebb. Pain and exhaustion crept in. She realized her left forearm stung. In the faint dashboard glow, she saw a shallow cut likely from flying glass. It was nothing compared to Nick's condition. She risked a glance at him. His head was lolling back against the headrest, eyes closed. For one heart-stopping second, she thought he wasn't breathing. But then he grimaced and sucked in a breath through clenched teeth. He was holding consciousness by a thread. "Stay with me, Nick," Grace pleaded softly. His eyes fluttered. "Lily," he rasped. Grace checked the mirror. Lily had finally cried herself into an exhausted sleep, curled up on the back seat floor. She looked unharmed, thank God. "She's okay. Try not to move. We're almost safe." Nick's hand groped weakly until it found Grace's on the gear shift. His fingers closed over hers. "Grace, I'm sorry," he breathed. "I never wanted to drag you into—" A wet cough cut him off. "Shh, don't talk." Her throat tightened at the feel of his blood-slick hand clutching hers. "Save your strength." He fell silent, but his hand remained over hers, trembling each time the car hit a bump. Grace kept her other hand firm on the wheel, forcing herself to concentrate through the blur of tears in her eyes. At last, the turnoff for the lake came. Grace maneuvered the sedan onto a narrow dirt road flanked by looming pines. The storm had dwindled to a drizzle. After a couple of winding miles, the headlights illuminated a small A-frame cabin at the end of the path, perched near the black expanse of the lake. It looked dark and deserted. "We're here," she whispered, more to herself than to Nick, who was barely responsive now. Grace parked and hurried to get Lily first. The girl was groggy but awake, whimpering at the sight of the unfamiliar cabin. "It's all right, sweetie. We're safe here," Grace assured, though her voice quivered. She carried Lily up the creaky porch and set her on an old couch inside. The cabin smelled of dust and mildew, but at least it was shelter. "Stay here, I need to help Mr. Nick, okay?" Lily nodded numbly, clutching her blanket. Grace ran back to the car. Nick hadn't moved. "Nick," she said urgently, patting his cheek. He groaned, eyelids half-masked. "That was enough for now." She pulled his arm around her shoulder. "Come on, lean on me." Using every ounce of strength, Grace half-dragged, half-walked him up the porch steps and inside, where he collapsed onto the wooden floor, unable to go further. Lily let out a frightened cry, seeing him sprawled and bloodied. "Is he gonna die, Mommy?" Grace's heart clenched. No, he's not," she said fiercely, praying it was true. "Lily, I need you to be brave and bring me that metal box on the shelf." She pointed to an old first aid kit box perched above the fireplace. While Lily fetched it, Grace tore off Nick's soaked jacket and shirt. The sight beneath nearly undid her. A bullet wound oozed blood just above his right hip, and a deep gash slashed across his ribs on the opposite side, perhaps from the fight or another near miss. His torso was mottled with old scars as well, ghostly evidence of past violence. She pushed down a surge of panic. "Focus. He's alive. Keep him that way." Lily brought the kit and Grace thanked her, sending her to get blankets from a cupboard. "Press this here, as hard as you can for just a minute," Grace told Nick, placing his hand over the bullet wound. He grimaced and did as told, blood welling between his fingers. Grace's mind raced back to basic first aid training. She grabbed a bottle of whiskey Mark's dad kept in the kit for disinfectant and poured it liberally over both wounds. Nick hissed in pain, muscles tensing. "I know, I'm sorry," Grace murmured. Working quickly, she used clean rags to wipe away blood and get a better look. The bullet wound had an exit. Thank God no bullet lodged. But he'd lost a lot of blood. She packed it with gauze and pressed firmly. Next, the gash. It was long but not too deep. She could close it with the butterfly bandages she found. Her hands shook as she adhered the tape, trying to remember everything from an old CPR class. Nick was going in and out of awareness, low groans slipping from his lips. Lily hovered nearby, tears in her eyes, but bravely holding a lantern she'd found, illuminating Nick's body for her mother. "You're doing good, honey," Grace encouraged her, voice tight. Finally, Grace wound rolls of bandages around Nick's midsection, securing the dressing over the bullet wound and the taped gash. The bleeding seemed to be slowing. Nick's breathing was shallow but steadier than before. When Grace gently pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, he felt clammy, but not as cold as earlier. She slumped back onto her heels, blood on her clothes and hands, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Lily set down the lantern and immediately crawled into Grace's lap, seeking comfort. Grace wrapped her arms around her daughter, and for a moment allowed herself silent tears of relief and fear and everything in between. "Mommy, will Nick be okay?" Lily whispered. Grace looked over at the unconscious man on the floor, his chest rising and falling faintly under the blankets she'd piled on him. She reached out and took his limp hand, squeezing it as if he could feel the promise she made in that moment. "He's going to be okay. He has to be," she answered softly. For a long time, Grace sat there on the floor between Lily and Nick, holding the small hand of her daughter and the larger hand of the man who had come to mean so much to them both. The storm finally passed, leaving only the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore outside. Grace knew questions loomed like shadows. Who exactly was Nick? Why were armed men hunting him? She had pieces of the puzzle, but now she needed the full truth. And if he survived this night, when he survived, she corrected herself, she intended to get it. Yet in that quiet cabin, as dawn approached, one truth shone clearest in her heart. Whatever his past, he had nearly died protecting them. The thought of losing him carved an ache in her chest she couldn't deny. At some point, exhaustion took hold, and Grace drifted into a light sleep against the couch. Lily curled up in her lap, their hands still joined with Nick's. When Nick finally stirred, morning light was filtering through the dusty cabin windows. Grace was at his side in an instant, easing him back when he tried to sit up. "Easy," she murmured, relief flooding through her. "You're okay. Well, you're alive. That's a start." Nick blinked, disoriented. His eyes darted around the unfamiliar cabin, then found Grace's face hovering over him. "Grace, Lily," he croaked. "She's safe. She's outside picking flowers by the porch. I told her to stay close," Grace said. She'd sent Lily out with a task to keep her occupied and away from the worst of their conversation. "We're at an old family cabin of mine. No one knows about it. We should be safe for now." Nick let out a slow breath, some tension draining from his bruised face. "You patched me up?" "Best I could." Grace managed a small smile. "You'll live if that's what you're asking, though you might have a scar or two to add to your collection." She tried to keep her tone light, but inside she was swirling with questions and emotions. He gingerly touched the bandages on his side and winced. Thank you, he said softly, eyes meeting hers with gratitude and something like shame. Grace, I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this to touch you or Lily. Grace drew a shaky breath. Now was the time. Nick, or whoever you are. Her voice trembled despite her resolve. I need you to be completely honest with me. No more half-truths, no more lies. Please. I deserve to know what we're caught in the middle of. Nick closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw ticking. When he opened them again, they glistened with regret. You're right. You do. He swallowed, his throat dry. First, my name. My real name is Dominic Moretti. Grace's brow furrowed. The name rang faint bells. Maybe from news? She wasn't sure, but she stayed quiet, letting him continue. He paused as if the words were hard to form. I'm the boss of a crime family back east. Or I was. Until a few weeks ago. Shame and bitterness mingled in his tone. Everything I told you about being a writer was a cover. I was hiding. There was an internal dispute, a power struggle. My second in command tried to have me killed. I barely escaped. I came out here to disappear for a while. Grace felt like the floor was tilting. Even though she'd suspected something criminal, hearing it confirmed was dizzying. A crime family, she repeated numbly. As in, the Mafia? He nodded once, eyes downcast. Yes, my family. I was born into it. I took over young after my father died. I did a lot of things I'm not proud of, Grace. His voice cracked slightly, but I never wanted to hurt innocent people. And I swear to you, I never wanted any harm to come to you or Lily. Grace stood up, needing a moment to process. She paced the small space between the couch and kitchen area, running a hand through her hair. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear, betrayal, and something else she couldn't name. So every day in my house you were lying to my face about who you were. Her words came out more sharply than she intended. All that talk about writing, moving around. I had to lie, Dominic said, pain in his expression that had nothing to do with his wounds. If you knew, you wouldn't have let me stay. And I needed a place to lay low. I thought I could keep you out of it entirely. Just be a tenant, pay in cash, mind my business. But, he trailed off, guilt and regret plain on his face. But then you saved my life. She stopped and looked at him, tears of anger and gratitude and confusion welling. And Lily's. God, I don't even know what I'm feeling right now. I should be terrified of you. You've probably hurt people or worse. She couldn't bring herself to say killed, though it hung in the air. She had seen him shoot those men last night after all. Dominic's eyes filled with anguish. I won't defend the man I was. Yes, I've hurt people. I've ordered things done. It was the life I was raised in. But I swear to you, Grace, these past weeks with you and Lily, it's the closest I've come to feeling human again in years. I didn't want to be that man around you, and I never would have let any harm come to either of you if I could help it. Grace pressed her hands to her face, taking a long, shaky breath. Those people who came last night, they were from your world? Dominic nodded heavily. Yes, the man who betrayed me, his name is Salvatore. Sal. He wants me out of the picture so he can take control. He must have gotten wind I was alive and tracked me down. He sent those men, possibly with help from someone I thought I could trust. His voice hardened at that, a flash of hurt and anger. That meeting you went to? It was a trap, wasn't it? Grace asked softly, pieces clicking together. He closed his eyes. Yes, a former friend arranged to meet, claimed he had intel for me. Instead, he led Sal's hitmen right to me. I managed to escape, but not before. He gestured to his bandaged side. I drove to the house because I didn't know where else to go. I'm sorry I brought them to you. Grace stepped closer, arms wrapped around herself. She could see how much speaking of the betrayal cost him. If you hadn't come, they would have found us undefended. You likely saved us by showing up when you did. Dominic looked up at her, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. Grace realized she meant it. Despite everything, she was glad he'd come to her for help. But that didn't erase her turmoil. What happens now? She asked quietly. Is Sal going to keep chasing you? Chasing us? He struggled to sit more upright against the couch. He won't stop until he's sure I'm dead. I need to get you and Lily far away from this. I have money, resources stashed. I can get you into hiding, new identities. Grace's eyes widened. Listen to yourself. New identities? On the run? Lily is 6 years old. Emotion swelled in her voice. She just started first grade. She has friends, a life. We can't just disappear. Dominic's face fell. I know, I'm sorry. This is my fault. I brought this danger into your lives. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. Once you're safe, I'll draw them away. Maybe turn myself into the feds, cut a deal to take Sal down. I don't care what happens to me as long as you two are all right." Grace's breath caught. The thought of him turning himself in or sacrificing himself made her chest ache unexpectedly. "Don't talk like that," she murmured. He gave a small, sad smile. "It might be the only way. I should have done it years ago." "Maybe I would have if—" He hesitated, then admitted quietly, "if I hadn't been too proud, or too afraid of what I'd become without that life." Grace kneeled beside him, her anger tempered by the raw honesty in his voice. "Dominic," she said softly, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. He looked at her, eyes haunted. "This is a lot for me to take in, and I am angry you lied. I'm scared of what might happen. But after all you've done for us, I can't just let you hand yourself over to be killed or locked up. There has to be another way." A tear escaped down her cheek. Almost unconsciously, Dominic reached out to gently wipe it away with his thumb. His touch was warm, careful, as if he thought he had no right to it. "I will never forgive myself for putting you and Lily in danger," he said, voice thick. "These past few weeks, you two became light in my life I didn't realize I was missing. I don't deserve it, I know, but—" He broke off, jaw tight as more emotions threatened to crack his composure. Grace covered his hand with hers on her cheek, holding it there. "You saved us. Again and again. That has to count for something." Her heart pounded at her own words, recognizing them as truth. He looked down at their joined hands, scars and all. "If anything happened to either of you," he whispered, "I wouldn't have wanted to go on. I've done terrible things, Grace, but you and Lily, you make me want to be better. To be worthy of—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Grace's breath caught at the implication. Before either could speak, the cabin door creaked open, and Lily padded in, clutching a handful of wilting wildflowers. She approached Dominic cautiously. "Mr. Nick, or, Dominic," she said in a small voice. Grace realized Lily must have overheard at least some of their talk. "Are you feeling better?" Dominic summoned a smile for her. "A little better, thanks to your mom." Lily carefully set the flowers on his lap. "These are for you. Mommy says flowers make people feel better when they're hurt." Dominic's composure visibly wavered. He touched the petals with a rough, blood-stained fingertip, as if they were the most delicate thing in the world. "They're beautiful. Thank you, Lily." His voice was husky. Lily gave him a quick, gentle hug around the shoulders, mindful of his injuries. Dominic froze for a half-second, then wrapped one arm around the little girl, eyes closing as he returned the embrace softly. Grace watched, emotion swelling in her chest. Whatever else Dominic was, the tenderness in that moment was real. Lily pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Are the bad guys gone now?" Dominic exchanged a glance with Grace, then answered, "The ones from last night won't hurt us anymore." He didn't sugarcoat or lie, Grace noted, but he also didn't mention the ones who might still be out there. Lily seemed satisfied for now. "Good. You won't let them hurt Mommy or me, right?" A flash of pain crossed his face, likely at the knowledge that he'd brought those dangers in the first place. But he cupped Lily's cheek gently. "Never. I'll do everything I can to keep you both safe. That's a promise." Lily nodded solemnly, then announced, "I'm hungry." The normalcy of her statement in the midst of chaos made Grace and Dominic share a quiet laugh. "I'll see what I can whip up, sweet pea," Grace said, standing and mussing her daughter's hair. In truth, the pantry stores here were sparse, but she recalled some canned soup that might still be good, as she went to heat a makeshift meal on the old propane stove. She kept an eye on Dominic and Lily. Lily sat cross-legged next to him, chatting about how she counted 9 deer outside and asking if Dominic liked animals. He responded to each of her questions patiently, even managing to joke softly when she insisted that unicorns might be real somewhere. Grace's heart constricted as she watched them, the gentle giant and the innocent child, finding solace in each other's company after a night of terror. But danger still loomed. Grace knew their reprieve could be temporary. They would have to figure out a plan soon, and even though part of her was still reeling from his revelations, she was more certain than ever of one thing. She didn't want to lose Dominic from their lives, not if there was a future where they could all be safe. As afternoon waned, Grace cleaned Nick's wound again and urged him to rest. He dozed fitfully on the couch, Lily tucked against his uninjured side, watching over him like a tiny guardian. Grace stepped outside on the porch for a moment of fresh air to steady her nerves. The sky was clearing to a pale orange as the sun dipped lower. For the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to hope they might actually be all right. That's when she heard it. A faint crunch of tires on the far-off gravel road, carried on the still air. Grace's stomach clenched. They weren't expecting anyone. Every instinct flared on high alert. She hurried back inside, latching the door. "Dominic," she hissed, shaking him gently. He was instantly awake, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "Someone's coming." "I heard a car." He sat up, stifling a groan. "Lily, come here," he whispered, urging the little girl to the back of the cabin. To Grace, he said, "Is there another way out?" Grace's mind raced. The cabin had a back door through the kitchen, but it led towards the same road. There was a root cellar hatch in the floor, but it only had a narrow crawl space inside. "We can hide in the cellar, but if they search..." Dominic shook his head, glancing around. He spotted the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, an antique, but possibly functional. He stood, wavering only slightly, and took it down. The rifle was old but loaded with 2 shells. He handed it to Grace. "Do you know how to use this?" Her hands trembled as she accepted the weapon. Mark had taken her hunting once, years ago. "Point and shoot, more or less," she whispered. He managed a faint smirk. "That'll do. Just only if you have to." Outside, the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves now. More than one person. Dominic scooped up his pistol from the floor and checked the magazine. Only a couple of bullets left. He muttered a curse under his breath. "Lily," Grace said softly, kneeling to her daughter, who was wide-eyed and fearful again. "We're going to play a hiding game, okay? See that little door?" She pointed to the rug they'd already pushed aside, revealing the wooden hatch to the root cellar. Lily nodded, tears brimming. "I need you to hide in there and be very quiet no matter what, until Mommy or Dominic comes for you. Can you do that, honey?" Lily trembled but nodded, trust shining in her wet eyes. "Are you and Mr. Dominic hiding too?" Grace forced a smile she didn't feel. "We'll be right here. We just need you super safe, all right?" She hugged Lily tightly, her heart breaking and stealing all at once. Dominic helped lift the hatch, and Grace lowered her brave little girl into the darkness below. "I love you so much," Grace whispered, touching Lily's curls before closing the hatch. "Remember, stay quiet as a mouse." The cabin's front window was small, but through the gauzy curtain, Grace saw shapes moving between the trees. 3, maybe 4 men. One called out loudly, mockingly, come out, wherever you are." The voice was unfamiliar, with a menacing sing-song lilt. Dominic's face hardened. "Sal's men," he murmured. He motioned Grace behind the heavy oak dining table, which they tipped on its side as a makeshift barricade. He positioned himself behind a bookshelf near the window, wincing as he raised his gun. The men outside spread out. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. She thumbed off the safety on the rifle like Mark had taught her. Her hands felt clammy on the wooden stock. A sudden crack of a handgun shattered the quiet. The muzzle flashed bright, outside as a bullet punched through the front door, splintering wood. Grace ducked. "Last chance, Moretti," a voice called. "We know you're in there. We had a lovely chat with your friend Marco before he expired." Dominic's eyes flashed with rage and grief. So his friend had been killed after all. "Sal!" he shouted back, voice fierce. "Let's end this!" Grace's blood ran cold. The underboss himself was here. "Gladly," Sal's voice answered. "Light it up, boys." Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the cabin's facade. Windows shattered. Grace felt glass shards spray over them. She covered her head, heart hammering as wood splinters flew. Dominic popped up and fired 2 shots toward the muzzle flashes. A grunt of pain told them he hit one. Grace dared to peek over the table. She saw a man fall by a tree, clutching his leg. But another figure was darting toward the side of the cabin. "They're flanking," Dominic hissed. Grace remembered the back door. She jumped up, leaving the cover of the table, and sprinted to the kitchen just as the back door burst open. A burly man stormed in, pistol raised. Without hesitation, Grace raised the rifle. The blast was deafening in the small kitchen. The recoil knocked her back a step. But the intruder took the shot square in the chest and went down with a strangled cry, his gun skittering across the floor. Grace's hands shook violently. She had never shot a person before, but there was no time to react. Another man appeared in the blown-open doorway, snarling. Before Grace could chamber the second shell, a shot rang out from the living room. Dominic's pistol. The second man crumpled, dead before he hit the threshold. Dominic had her back. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were Grace's ragged breathing and a faint ringing in her ears. She locked eyes with Dominic across the room. Relief was short-lived. "Moretti!" a voice roared, the man by the tree, still alive. Grace heard heavy footsteps stomping onto the porch. Dominic moved toward her, but suddenly a new figure lunged through the destroyed front door, fast as a viper. Sal. The man was tall, bulky, with a cruel, weathered face. He trained a handgun on Dominic instantly. Dominic aimed back, but Sal had a human shield, Lily. Grace's heart seized in pure horror. Sal had yanked a terrified Lily out of the cellar. She must have peeked out when the shooting stopped. The girl struggled in his grip, a whimpering cry of, "Mommy!" tearing from her throat. Sal held her in front of him, gun pressed to her temple. "Drop it, Dom!" Sal barked, his tone exultant. "Or the kid dies right now." Dominic's face went ashen. "No, Lily!" His gun remained trained on Sal, but Grace could see his hands trembling in fury and fear. "Dominic," Grace said in a strangled voice, raising her hands in surrender and stepping out from the kitchen with the rifle lowered. She could barely breathe. "Do as he says. Please." She caught Dominic's agonized gaze. Lily's wide, tearful eyes were on them both. Every second stretched taut. Then slowly, Dominic bent and set his pistol on the floor, kicking it away. He raised his hands, chest heaving with rage and desperation. "Let her go, Sal. This is between you and me." Sal sneered. "Touching. You always were weak under that tough act, Dom. Playing house with this little family, did you honestly think you could get away from who you are?" He laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You're a dead man walking. But don't worry, I'll take good care of what's left of the Moretti Empire once you're gone. Maybe I'll even raise this little girl as my own, teach her the business." Grace's fear ignited into fury. She saw Dominic's fists clench, but unarmed and injured, he was helpless to stop Sal from pulling the trigger. Sal began to tighten his aim on Dominic's heart. In that split second, Grace knew what she had to do. Sal was so focused on Dominic that he'd edged slightly to the side, giving Grace a partial angle. And Sal had likely assumed she was out of ammo after one rifle blast. He assumed wrong. Grace slowly shifted her stance, the rifle still in her hands at her side. Her finger slid to the second trigger. Every fiber of her being screamed to wait for the shot. Lily was so close to him, no margin for error. Dominic locked eyes with Grace. He gave the smallest nod, trust and pleading all at once. He understood. He would distract Sal for one critical moment. "If you want me, come and finish it," Dominic snarled, taking one step forward. "Leave them out of it, you coward." "Daddy, no!" Lily cried out innocently at Dominic's movement, the word bursting from her lips by instinct, her first time calling him that, and it shattered something in Grace's chest. Sal barked a cruel laugh and moved the gun toward Lily. "Maybe I'll just start with..." Grace raised the rifle in one fluid motion, aiming at the only target she had, Sal's head, half exposed above Lily's. She pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening. Sal's head snapped back as the bullet struck true. For a split second, he stayed upright, a look of shock on his face. Then his grip slackened and he toppled backward, Lily slipping from his arms. Dominic was there in 2 strides, catching Lily up and away from Sal's falling body. He shielded her against his chest and dropped to his knees, covering her as insurance against any last shots. But Salvatore Russo was dead before he hit the floorboards, a dark red hole between his eyes. Grace's shot had been perfect. The silence after the gunfire was surreal. Grace stood trembling, the rifle still braced in her shoulder. It slowly slid from her numb fingers and thudded to the ground. "Lily!" she gasped, rushing forward. Dominic turned, still on his knees, and gently set the crying child into her arms. Grace enveloped her daughter, sobbing with relief and shock. "I've got you, baby, I've got you," she crooned, kissing Lily's face over and over. Dominic rose unsteadily, and before Grace knew it, his arms came around them both, pulling Grace and Lily into a fierce embrace. Grace buried her face in Dominic's chest, tears soaking into his shirt as Lily was pressed warmly between them. They were alive. By some miracle, they were all alive. "It's over," Dominic whispered, his voice a ragged mix of awe and reassurance. "You did it, Grace. You saved us." She felt his lips pressed to the top of her head in a tender, trembling kiss. Grace drew back just enough to see his face. There were tears on his lashes, and pure adoration in his eyes as he looked at her. In that moment, the last walls between them crumbled. She reached up and touched his cheek gently. "We saved each other." Her voice shook with everything she felt. Dominic's hand caressed her face, brushing away tears. "I love you," he breathed, the words escaping as if he could no longer hold them back. "I love you both so much." Grace's heart swelled. All her fear, her doubts, had been consumed by the fire of what they'd just endured. She knew the truth of her own heart. "I love you too," she whispered. Then she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a kiss born of desperation and relief, of gratitude and passion all at once. Dominic kissed her back with equal fervor, one arm around her waist holding her close, the other cradling Lily against them. Lily wriggled, making a small sound of protest at being squished, and they broke the kiss with soft, breathless laughter. Dominic pressed his forehead to Grace's, eyes closed. "I thought I'd lost both of you," he murmured. "We're right here," Grace replied, cupping the back of his neck. "We're not going anywhere." For a long moment, they stayed like that, three battered souls clinging to each other in the wreckage of the little cabin, surrounded by the aftermath of chaos, yet wrapped in a cocoon of love and safety that felt unbreakable. In the aftermath, Sal's death marked the end of Dominic's old life. With the Mafia threat gone, and Dominic Moretti officially declared dead in the chaos, he was free to become someone new. Under Grace's care, he recovered from his wounds, and when he was strong enough, they quietly sold her house and moved far away to start fresh, together. They settled in a quiet coastal town, in a cottage by the sea. Lily spent her days collecting seashells and chasing waves, while Grace and Dominic built the peaceful life neither had dared dream of. One breezy evening, as the sun set in a blaze of pink and gold, Grace watched Dominic swing Lily onto his shoulders in the yard, her squeals of delight echoing on the salt-kissed air. Lily's pure joy and Dominic's unguarded laughter were sights that made Grace's heart brim over. She stepped off the porch and into the yard as Dominic set Lily down. The little girl dashed away with their scruffy new puppy, leaving Grace and Dominic standing together in the rosy twilight. He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. In worn jeans and bare feet, he looked every bit the handsome, gentle soul she'd fallen in love with, free of the shadows that once haunted him. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace teased softly, noticing the thoughtful light in his green-gray eyes. Dominic smiled and shook his head. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he murmured. "A few months ago, I never imagined life could be like this." Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "We're both lucky," she replied. "We took a chance on each other, and look where it led." He turned and kissed her temple gently. "Thank you for believing in me, Grace, for seeing the man I could be." She gazed up at him, eyes shining. "We saved each other. You gave Lily and me a home again." Dominic's answer was a tender kiss under the painted sky, a promise of all the days of love yet to come. When they drew apart, Lily was bounding back to them, proudly holding a pink seashell. Dominic swooped her into his arms, making her giggle as he admired her find. Grace wrapped her arms around them both, her family. They stayed like that as day turned to night, a family forged by fate and redeemed by love. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together. In Grace's heart and in Dominic's soul, at long last, they had found home.